Well, welcome everybody, and hello to those of you who might be checking this out a little bit later on your own time in video format. Welcome to the Circus Talk Pro Talk. I'm Stacy Clark, CEO of Circus Talk. I'm a white woman in my 50s of average height and athletic build. I have long blonde hair, although I've got to admit it's starting to go a little bit ashy grayish blondie, and I wear reading glasses with a wooden frame. I'm wearing a dark gray shirt with a purple patterned scarf today. I have a really special guest joining me for today's Pro Talk, joining us, in fact, because as many of you know, the floor will be open to you to ask questions before too long, in about the halfway mark, or sort of depending on when Billy's ready to throw open the floor. And I'm breaking my own rule here because I don't usually read an introduction. I often will sort of pass the torch early to my guest, which I will do in just a second, but I am actually going to read Billy's bio so that we can get all of the hardcore information made clear, and then he will take us on the journey of unpacking some of that and sharing some of his experiences. So Billy Alwen is joining us from Cirque, Bijou and Extraordinary Bodies. And here we go. I'm now reading. A former aerialist, artistic director Billy Alwen co-founded Cirque Bijou with Julian Bracy in 1999. In 2013, on the heels of the London Olympic Games, Cirque Bijou partnered with Diverse City, which led to the creation of Extraordinary Bodies. For context, Diverse City is a performing arts company where social justice and culture meet. They believe that for the arts to fairly reflect and shape society, all voices must be heard and all audiences welcomed. Extraordinary Bodies is Circus for every body. Their work combines the talent of deaf, disabled, and non-disabled artists. They create magical spaces where diversity is welcome, boundaries are broken, and inclusivity is celebrated. And we are going to put a couple links in the chat with the destination websites of both Cirque Bijou and Extraordinary Bodies. So now's the time where I get to say officially, welcome, Billy.
Thanks, Stacy. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am a white man in his 50s. I've got sort of curly grey hair. I'm wearing a black top. And I'm sat down. When I'm stood up, I'm around 6 foot and slim build. I would really love people's questions. I would love to have a conversation rather than talk for too long. But just to kind of start, I think the things that I'm really interested in talking about are, how do we make an inclusive space in both the rehearsal room and on stage? How do we make work that really can make those social changes? When I started Extraordinary Bodies with Claire Hodgson about 12 years ago, there were two motivations for us. One was, we're both political with a small p. We're making work. And that's the prime objective of both of us, artistic directors. But we're also interested in making social change. But I'm also interested in just making really interesting circus, and I'm interested in casting as widely as possible and making work with as many interesting people and bodies and skills as possible. So primarily, my motivation of working with an integrated company of disabled and non-disabled artists, diverse company, was to make circus that perhaps looked a little bit different on stage, reached different audiences, possibly changed who was in the audience, and challenged us as directors to think about how we make that circus, what equipment we use, how the rehearsal process should work, and whether those things need to change. And I think probably the pandemic has changed lots of things as well for us all in terms of how we approach making work in a rehearsal room, and also what's important to put on stage. So those are the things that are important for us. The most important thing, I guess, for us now, having been working in for about 12 years, is where are the next generation of young circus artists who are going to make this work? We aren't the only ones making this type of work, and we certainly never set out to be the only ones. When we cast, particularly when we try and look for young disabled circus artists, even when we cast internationally, there isn't a big range of artists to choose from, and there are more companies wanting to cast disabled artists within their shows, public and commercial. I think there's a difference between casting commercial and sort of publicly funded work, which is good to talk about. But the big thing for us is talent development. How do we make sure that more young disabled people see a future in circus as a professional option? How do we encourage circus schools to make their schools accessible and their programs accessible? Because we are dependent on making it work with from the artists to come in who we can cast. So, you know, there are big challenges, and I feel like we're just sort of at the sort of foothills, really. You know, we've made some work, and we've made some, hopefully we've had some impact, but I feel like we have a huge amount to do. And one of the biggest challenges is how to change how commercial work is made and who it's made with. Because that, for me, is probably the biggest challenge at the moment. So I can carry on talking. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm going to interject every now and then. Do you specify commercial work because you feel that it has some kind of power to affect change, a bigger, perhaps weightier reach?
No, more to do with the fact that there are different forces at work in terms of who is cast for commercial work is very different to who is potentially cast in public work. It's a different audience. It reaches different people, and for people to sustain a profession in circus, they need a mix of work. And obviously, in times at the moment, I don't know what it's like in I imagine we're in a similar sort of economic situation, but particularly in the UK at the moment, it's a difficult economic situation, and you need a mix of work to survive professionally. You can't rely on one income stream, and commercial work is harder to break into, I think, particularly if you're disabled, because I think there is probably a prejudice around the aesthetic of it. And I'm kind of making these assumptions, but you know, I feel that there potentially is. But the people that really need to answer that question are probably those artists who are disabled and making that work, rather than myself, who's a non-disabled white man. I'm probably the most undiverse person to be speaking on this. But so I think, you know, I think there are bigger challenges in doing that, in making commercial work more diverse in that way.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the very real challenges, let's do a little bit of celebrating, and maybe you can take us through a particular project that you're especially proud of and give us some context about what your process is, your devising style, the nature of collaboration that's so important to you. Share a little bit of your wins.
Well, so a project we started in that, well, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were planned, and like many others, planning to tour a new show. And obviously for most of us, that finished it became very clear in March 2020 that wasn't going to happen, and we lost that particular tour. So we began to think about what we would do next. Could we, when everything opened up again, could we retour that show? We felt that show wasn't relevant. Actually, what the story we were telling wasn't still relevant to us, and wasn't really, we needed to tell a different story. So we started making a new show, and because we weren't allowed to meet up, we made a show at the beginning over, as many people did, online, and we met artists, we made work, created, worked with our composers and our digital artists, and until we could actually get back in a room. And that process took about, probably that initial process took about a year until we got back in a room. And I think because of that, the work was much stronger. We never made a piece of work over that period of time that long. And because we had that long to think about it and make it, I think the writing was stronger. The end result was much stronger. The piece, the show was called Human, and it really reflected the time we were in and the stories of 4 artists. Simply, the story was about our love of sweets. Actually, what that opened up, our love of sweets, opened up issues around mental health, issues around what it is to be a mother, what it is, how the artist mothers were central to their lives and what it meant to them. It opened many themes, but it actually started with that simple theme around the love of your favorite sweet. And what we did is we collected audio from all of our artists. We brought that audio together, and the show was made in a series of chapters, partly on digital, partly on stage, and they were interconnected stories with each of the 4 artists. And one artist that actually never appeared on stage, only on the screen, because he felt at that point, he was a disabled artist, felt it wasn't safe for him to come back into a theatre. That show ended up touring for about over 2 years. And so that devising process was strange for us, because we made it partly online, and then we eventually got back in the room. But obviously, that for all of us at that point, when we got back in the room, it was difficult to make work when we were still trying to social distance, particularly circus work. But I enjoyed that process because of the length it took to make that piece of work, and I think it was better because of it. And actually, we are now considering our next piece of work, and I think actually that length of time really suits us in considering what we're doing, consideration of the writing, the story, gathering that over a longer period of time. In England, often when we make publicly funded work, and particularly commercial work, we have a very short amount of time of making work. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks, but weeks is the luxury. So that was a fantastic opportunity for us.
Maybe you can share a little bit about the artists themselves. You've mentioned that you work with both disabled and non-disabled individuals. How do you find them? What is your network? You've already mentioned that you struggle to find enough, but the artists that you have had the pleasure of working with, tell us a little bit about them.
Well, I think a lot of our artists, interestingly, when the Olympics was made in 2012 in London, National Centre Circus put together a team of artists to launch the Paralympics, and many of those were taught circus, and majority of those were in their sort of 30s and 40s and were actors, the disabled artists. They hadn't come from circus, they hadn't had formal circus training. They might have had some informal circus training through their acting careers. And so there was a sort of there were very few young artists. So our challenge was always to find the young artists, disabled artists, that potentially either had some training or would do some training with us. We're not a training organization. One example is Jonathan Leach, who joined us in an R&D as a drummer. Johnny doesn't have use of his legs, he's a wheelchair user, and during our warm-ups, Johnny would join in the warm-up and move using his hands. And we were saying to Johnny, like, you've got amazing movement, you move beautifully, how have you done any training? He said, no, that's just how I move around the house at home when I was a kid. I just bounce around the room and I I use my arms to sort of get onto the sofas, and I just don't use my wheelchair. So I'm always using my arms to move around. And Johnny develops incredible upper body strength. And we thought, actually, Johnny, and he's also a fantastic a dancer with his wheelchair. So we started integrating Johnny into some of the circus work, and he's done several shows with us now. He's a fantastic aerialist, works as a double aerialist with a woman called Tilly Lee Cronick. And together they do something which I think is quite unique. I haven't seen anywhere else, but a beautiful double static routine. And that came literally from a chance conversation and an invitation that Johnny had as a musician. And generally that is how it's happened. Because in my knowledge, and maybe somebody will tell me I'm wrong, but as far as I understand, in the UK, I know one disabled artist has gone through formal circus training. So most people that come to us come through informal circus or no circus at all, and have adapted their skills, either dance or physical theatre.
So with that information, what would you rather see if you had your druthers and you could make it different? What would you change?
What would I change in terms of if I could go back and change the sort of the setup of circus? Or
I think from the standpoint of the system itself. So there are some systemic challenges, I would argue, if there's only one person in the UK that's had formal education in circus.
Well, I don't think during the in 2016 we got a significant grant from the government to do some work with a lot of different work, make some new shows and to make some strategic interventions in training. And we worked with the 2 circus schools, in fact, 3 circus institutions across the country. And I don't think the barriers of the circus schools necessarily. I think they are accessible. We produced a training document for circus trainers. There's obviously lots of education. There potentially are always some kind of barriers, but I think the biggest issue is that circus is not seen as a viable professional option for disabled artists. I think one of the things that I think we can do as a company is by putting on shows on stage with a diverse cast. That changes the audience, and it also tells people that actually this is a great opportunity, creative opportunity, professional opportunity to do something, and that there is an opportunity as disabled artists to have a really amazing career within circus, as Johnny and some others have done. I'm not sure that it's necessarily I wouldn't like to sort of point a finger at the circus schools. I think the issue is around the sort of the perception of circus as an opportunity. There are some great dance companies, some integrated dance companies, and some great integrated and disabled-led theatre companies in the UK doing some brilliant work. And there are more actors and dancers, disabled actors and dancers. There are still issues around, and I won't mention it, but there's still issues around theatre schools and access for disabled artists. I know through disabled friends of mine who've gone through that process. It isn't perfect, but I think really what we can do as a company is be a showcase for the shows that can say, look, we can put on shows with an amazing mixed and integrated cast, and that really does change the audience. And actually those people in the audience are those that I hope will go back and potentially become some of our potentially future circus artists. I mean, that is what I think our role is. We're not a training organization, although we work with training organizations, but I think our role is really to change who's in the audience and who's on stage.
One of the points you shared with me earlier was very much about reinventing the circus aesthetic. So you are going to the finish line with projects that are more or less putting your money where your mouth is, doing the work in order that it be seen and understood as possible. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
What would you offer to folks who have the same aspiration then, knowing that you don't want to be the only ones doing this, that there are globally probably only a handful that at least I'm aware of, and I would happily be better informed on that if people could raise their hand and share about other companies doing this kind of work. Point being, there's not that many, but I think the intention is really strong. As you mentioned earlier in your intro, there's a desire. How to do it, how to get started. What would you suggest to someone who comes to you saying, I want to be like you?
I think it's finding your collaborators, isn't it? It's choosing your collaborators. I mean, we make work. I mean, I make work in collaboration, um, uh, either as co-director or with the artist in the room, and the artist and the key artists in the room, both disabled and non-disabled, and we make work together. It's about who you collaborate with and you make that work with, and what stories you want to tell. And I don't think there are any. For me, there are no barriers to making that work. The work does make the work might take a little bit longer because there's some considerations around the communication, around the process, and we can talk about the details of what's needed in the room to make work. And yes, you do need perhaps some different things, but really, I don't feel the barriers. There are barriers there. I mean, for me, really, what it was about was really just wanting to make really exciting and different work, um, and having a different type of challenge, challenging myself as a circus maker to go, right, okay, there are different bodies. I think circus, the thing about circus for me is that we work with so many different art forms. We are used to taking risks. Claire, who worked with me on the Olympics, said to me, she hadn't worked with a company that was so happy and so comfortable with risk. We had on stage, when we made that show in 2012, we had some life-saving equipment for some artists who needed generators, and sort of constant power to power equipment that would keep those people alive on stage. We were flying disabled artists from cranes and 30 meters up. But for us, risk, it's the same risk. There was no difference. For us, risk didn't change. I don't see we saw any barriers to that. And I think that's what was refreshing to those that started collaborating with a circus company. Go, oh yeah, you're used to risk. You're used to doing these things. So that's why I think circus is the right art. It's a great, it's the right art form for doing innovative and groundbreaking stuff, because we're used to doing that. That's what we do. So I would say, people want to do this work. I mean, there are no barriers to doing it. I mean, obviously, I feel like, yes, there are physical things that are needed. You need flat access to rooms. But actually, most circus spaces are already designed in that way. You might need slightly better amenities for toilets, etc. But actually, those are really simple, basic things to change. You might need some interpreters in the room if you're working with deaf artists, some support workers. But really, for me, the barriers are easily overcome. They're very simple.
You touched earlier on the desire to bring more variety, more diversity, more disabled artists into the commercial circus space. How do we make that happen?
Well, I mean, it's partly on us as companies to propose that work and those artists, which we do, and it's also, I think, on the part of those people that are on the promoters and the organizations to. I mean, it's not a risk, but it feels like sometimes they are taking a risk by changing the aesthetic. I feel like often commercial work is the most conservative work in some ways, because there are I don't know what the barriers are, but it feels like there are barriers around taking risk on doing something different. I feel like public funded work, we are able to take more control of the creative work ourselves and take those risks. But commercial promoters are often reticent about doing something a little bit different. That's not saying that's for everybody, but I think also there is a lack of artists working at that level, disabled artists. There are some brilliant exceptions, but I think it is partly because there are people haven't had access to the training in the same way that non-disabled artists have. When you're casting, which you will know well, Stacey, when you're casting shows, you will have probably 90% of non-disabled artists to choose from, and maybe less. I don't know what the percentage is, but a very small percentage of disabled artists to choose for the same piece of work. So it's partly to do with the lack of availability. We did do some work around casting and bringing in lots of different companies to do joint casting and sharing artists that we work with among a bigger group of companies to try and really push the artists that we work into different companies. But really, that's why I feel like we're still quite at a low starting point. And I also think sometimes companies can make great decisions and terrible decisions. A company that had a brilliant circus artist as a star, disabled artist as a star of their show, and then recast that exact same act to do with a non-disabled artist using the same piece of equipment. I won't name the company, but I felt like that was a massive step forward and a big step backwards. So I think I think companies have a responsibility as well.
What can you share about disabilities that aren't visible and how we can be serving those folks better?
Well, one thing we do at the start of any project is send what we call an access audit out to all of our cast members, because as you say, disability isn't always visible. And I think we send it to everybody, non-disabled, disabled, everybody. I fill out an access form. We all work in different ways. We all need different things to make that work. And I think luckily that has changed to a degree. I think partly through COVID and the pressure of artists making and asking for change in rehearsal room. But I feel like rehearsal rooms are changing for the better, and people are asking for what they want and have the confidence to ask for what they want. But I think that's important, that people have the opportunity to ask for what they need to make work. We always say, you need to tell us what you need to make your best work. I think the sort of old model of being told, working 14 hours, working in really hard, tough conditions, I hope is changing, because that's not ideal for people, particularly doing circus work. And I think people are definitely asking for change. So I think definitely that is one thing that we can do by looking at everybody's needs in the round, and really listening to what people want. I'm not sure that's answered all of your question, but
What I'm taking away from that is the power of asking, what do you need? And then equally the responsibility and courage to be able to answer that question. That's how the collaboration really becomes the most fruitful.
Yes, absolutely. And to take that criticism and to really, really evaluate the project after the project, and to listen to that feedback and then improve it, and to be able to move on and adapt. I think that's really, really important. And sometimes what people need can conflict in a room. I mean, simple things, working with visually impaired artists, they may want they often will want a different lighting setup in a room. Fluorescent lighting tubes are terrible for particularly for those with visual impairment, because they flicker. Some people might want a warm room, a cold room. Sometimes those different requests conflict, you know, and people have different needs. So it's a negotiation, and I think you have to work hard to sort of make sure that that room works for everybody. So yes, it is a constant negotiation, and being willing to sort of have those conversations openly with everybody, and not to dictate.
It's interesting because you mentioned that there doesn't need to be barriers, or in fact, a lot of times those barriers are very much resolvable or overcomable. But all of that goes without saying. It still takes work. It takes effort. It takes a really deliberate commitment to staying as open as you're describing, to be able to do your best to meet all those different needs.
Yeah, and that's why it's really good to.
Sorry. Interrupt.
No, I was going to say,
that's why it's really open the floor here.
Yeah.
This is always the moment where there's sort of like crickets and people aren't entirely sure if they want to have a voice in the conversation or not, but we really welcome you and invite you to engage. And you don't have to have a question. Maybe you have an experience that you might want to recount, or perhaps you have some other kind of story that you'd like to tell. We're all ears. So please do feel welcome to anyone who is so inspired. Go ahead and unmute yourselves and flick on your camera for a sec so that we can connect to the human in the box, and do feel welcome. Billy came out of the gate right away saying he'd love to answer some questions. So let's offer him some. Who's going to break the ice for me? All right, I'm going into the chat to read what Lacey, I think it's Lacey, is saying. Bear with me while I open that up. Fair enough. So thank you, Lacey. Only able to listen because Lacey's in a quiet space at the moment and not allowed to talk. Maybe that's a covert listening thing that you're doing at the moment while you're meant to be putting your bandwidth somewhere else, or you're in a library. Either way, thanks. Anybody have anything that they'd like to bring directly? Oh, you're in a ride share. Hilarious. Okay. Super fair. Way to commit to joining in anyway.
Okay, so I'll start. Let me check my camera. Okay, I don't know if that's working. Yeah. Hello. I'm from Germany, by the way, so I'm having like a full day behind me already, and I'm quite tired. But I'm very happy to be here. I'm not having a question, but I just want to say I'm doing my training to be a physiotherapist right now, and I'm also doing aerial silk. So, and I worked a bit with disabled children. So it's like super inspiring to hear this, and it's super inspiring how you make all of this possible for these people. And yeah, maybe I do have a question, because I mean, there are different people with different needs also when it comes to communication. Like, how do you do that? Like when you want to make an announcement, or like when you want to communicate with the people and all of them need something else, how do you still make it possible to get the information through at the same time for, like, yeah, deaf people, blind people, whatever? Yeah.
No, it's a really good question. And I think when I first went into rehearsal room, I had to learn really quickly. You know, I'm still learning. I feel like I'm still right at the bottom of the mountain, you know, but I think there's two ways. There's two things. One, that yes, you can put in people support to support that communication. I think you need to leave more time to do that, which is what I was saying about the rehearsal process. You definitely need to add more time into the rehearsal process if you've got if you've got lots of different communication needs in the group of artists, because you may have somebody interpreting through sign language, or you may need somebody doing some form of audio description of the work that's happening. So you may need an audio describer for a visually impaired artist. But the other thing is that actually, once you get into the rehearsal process, the company itself learns how to communicate with each other. You don't need necessarily the input from myself or co-directors. That, for instance, we were working, when the first show I made with Extraordinary Bodies, we were working with a piece of equipment that weighed a quarter of a ton, big piece of steel flying around the room. And you have, obviously, we had people in the room that were both deaf and visually impaired. And obviously, there are safety issues around that, because you've got a piece of equipment that somebody can't see particularly well, or somebody can't hear any warnings. So the company learned to communicate themselves. They found their own way of communicating as a group of artists within the show. And that's where I think, for me, it's really important that you do that work to bring the company together before you really go into the detail of the process. And we have done that successfully, and I've also been in a process where I haven't done that as well as I could have done, and that has made that work difficult, because everybody has a different experience and different way of making work, whether you're disabled or non-disabled. You may come from theatre background or devising. So you really, I feel, for me, that unless the company has worked together a lot on a regular basis, they need time to really learn how to work together into a room. And that's my job, but also the artist's job. So that is essential for me, to make that a safe working space.
Thank you for that contribution. You know, it strikes me that what you're describing really reinforces the culture of a company, both from the perspective of being genuinely collaborative, sharing responsibility, but also empowering. So it's not just a top down, here's how this is going to be because I want it to be that way as director, but you're playing your role as a leader to create the space in which everybody can come together and create their own systems and figure themselves out and work in a cohesive way. So that, for me, really drives the importance of culture within the company and creating a safe space, figuratively and literally.
Yeah, and it is both, and it definitely is both, about making it safe in both definitions of the word. But it is a collaborative space. I mean, most of our work we make is devised work. I mean, we have recently worked with a written script, and that is different, and actually was a more complicated process. But a devised working space is obviously very collaborative, and we're led by different people in the room, and that is important. And that's what we do as a company. Different people lead, different aspects, different skills come in. I feel sometimes as a director, we're facilitating as much as directing and taking a lead, And as two directors, often what we will do, we will go into a space and one of us will watch, observe and feedback, and one will lead. And often other artists will do the same.
We've been talking about the diverse makeup of artists principally. Does that extend into other roles in the creative process? The staff, the crew, other creators?
Yeah. It does. Not as much as it should do. I think when we're talking about diversity, you're looking at, we need to be looking at the technical team, the stage management team. The problem is, and I don't know whether this is true around the world, but the problem is in the UK is that many working spaces, theatre spaces, are not accessible still. We've had situations where we're working on where the stage to the auditorium is not accessible for many of our team, or the access to the theatre means going through loading yards, or that there aren't accessible toilets. That, you know, it's not, the problem is that actually some of these spaces are not kind of fit for purpose, and many because these theatres were built in the 1700s, 1800s, and they weren't designed, people weren't thinking about that, you know. But yes, the environment that people are working in has to be thought through, you know, not just the set but the whole space, if really we're going to make a difference, if actually we're going to change the team that are making the shows as much as the team that are on stage. You're right, it's as important to think about what happens behind the scenes.
You touched earlier, and by the way, folks, if you do have a question, just do your little Zoom hand or come off mute and say hi. That's totally cool. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. You talked about talent development. How? What's your plan for not just, I know, right? Put you on the spot, fix everything.
Well,
what does that look like for you?
Well, we are at the moment putting in proposals for a talent development project, and this is actually not around the national circus schools, although it will connect. It's actually around sort of a series of master classes, as much around the informal social circus training spaces. The key thing around talent development is finding or reaching those potential young artists, emerging artists, and attracting them into the program. That is always been, for me, like the thing that we haven't necessarily solved. And I think there are possible avenues. In Britain, there are a lot of British Gymnastics Foundation have groups, have foundations around that support disabled gymnasts into gymnastics. It's transitioning from one area of sort of sport skill into another. In Circus, I know Soleil obviously recruit a lot from gymnastics. There's a lot of dance that goes into Circus, some theatre, but really, I think the key thing is finding that group of people that are going to have the right skill set or passion to go into Circus. And I think we've got the trainers, we've got the skills, and we've got the spaces. What we need to do is find those people.
Yeah,
and that's the challenge for us.
It feels chicken and egg, because on the one hand, you're saying by making the work, you're starting to demonstrate that this is a viable and very real possibility for folks who may not have known or had the belief that it could be true. By the same token, it's hard to make that work if you don't have access to the talent, if the talent pool is so scarce. Yeah. So there is this challenge implicit, let alone all the things that are outside of our control that could potentially be perceived as roadblocks. So that type of partnership, the same way that you had an earlier partnership with what was the kickoff, it sounds like, to Extraordinary Bodies, are you looking at forming other kinds of liaisons and partnerships with organizations such as the one you mentioned under the British Gymnastic Federation?
Well, yeah, and I'm also interested in partnerships with other art forms. Circus has gone into opera, obviously it's gone into dance. There are we've talked to some big commercial dance companies about partnering. I'm really interested in working with. I know that there are some fantastic artists that are trained to wheelchair users, trained as ballerinas. There's some great dancers. I think really we are talking about a very small number of people. At some point, there's a tipping point where you need to have that number of people that are going to make that change, push the change. And I don't know where they're going to come from. It needs a significant investment, a strategic investment by a funding body to do that, make that change. And that's what we're trying to push at the moment, is to find that significant investment to make a significant cultural change. Because as a small organization, like, you know, we cannot do it alone, unfortunately, you know, and it will take a long time. If you look at other art forms that have really changed over those years, dance, theatre, that it's taken a very long time, particularly dance is the forerunner. I mean, there's a lot of fantastic integrated dance companies, you know, that have made that change, but that's taken a long time.
Have you in fact noticed a change in, or a diversification, let's say, in your audiences?
Yeah, really significantly, and that's what had the biggest impact on me when we made our first show in 2013. I saw the audience, and that was because of who was on stage. It's because of the people on stage network the best people to really sort of change what happens on stage. Other people, who those disabled artists are on stage because they have fantastic networks within their communities, but also if you're going to a show, you want to see yourself represented on stage. You know, you want to see you want to see that story being told by somebody who you can empathize with, and that makes the difference. And that audience changed significantly in Exeter when we made the show. It was really it made a big impact on me. I suddenly realized it doesn't matter what you talk about in making your marketing really diverse or different, or using different fonts or different colors. Actually, the biggest change you can make if you want to change your audience is who you put on stage. I know Stacey's got a question.
Okay, let me pop this open for us here. I'll go ahead and read it if that's okay. There's a couple in the chat, and for those of you who live, again, invitation stands, raise your little hand or come off mute or flick on your camera. Lacey's question perhaps: I noticed that one aspect of this process is to find those young folks with the right skill sets, and also with the anecdote of the Paralympic show, it makes me think. I imagine that it is something the Paralympic folks also have. They want to find those folks that they can serve. Maybe they might have some insight. So do you actually have a connection with the Paralympic organization?
Well, yes, we did. And what stopped us was sponsors. We were going to do some work with Paralympic organisation, and there was a disagreement between the sponsor of one show that we were working with and the sponsor of the Paralympic organisation, and it didn't work. And it was purely to do with sponsors not agreeing, which is a terrible thing, and it makes me very cross.
Yeah, that's disheartening.
I think the thing that I would say, though, is that we made I don't know if it's a political decision, but we made a decision that when we did our show in 2012 in Weymouth for the Olympics, that our show was part of the Olympic opening of that event, not the Paralympic. And for me, I have no issue with the Paralympics or Paralympic opening ceremonies, but if you are saying that only disabled artists can be in the Paralympic opening show, for me, that feels very wrong. So we made a decision, you call it political or whatever, but we made a decision that actually we wanted our performance to be part of the main show. Why should disabled artists not be part of any show? And it's a dangerous thing to get too much involved in politics, and we're not political in that way. But I feel like those statements, those things, decisions you can make that are putting out the right positive message. And for me, that I feel like sometimes things become ghettoized, they become segmented in the space, and they are stuck there. And I felt like that sometimes happens around sort of Paralympic opening shows, where people feel like we need to make sure there are disabled representation. No, you don't. You need to make sure there's disabled representation in everything, in every show. Sorry, I can get very passionate about that because it makes me very cross. But that is a decision we made with extraordinary bodies, and also our work to be. And I'm talking about integrated casts and disabled artists, but really our work is about just making circus. I mean, yes, we do talk about. Obviously, there are disabled artists in our shows, but really, our show is a show. We tell stories, we make circus. We're not trying to change the world in that way. We're just trying to make a great circus show with great artists, and we prefer to talk about our artists as artists and not as non-disabled or disabled. And I know we're talking about that, but because it does need unpacking. But I think primarily what I think extraordinary bodies about is just making circus. Whoever's in the room,
I want to do another bit of a deep dive here, and thanks, Andrea, for contributing this as well. We've sort of dodged around the casting process and the need for some strategic recruitment initiatives. Certainly, the idea that having representation can certainly be a provocation toward stepping into the space oneself. But when it comes to the commercial circus, when it comes to, frankly, any organization, what do you feel can be done, or what practices could be altered to be more inclusive in the casting, both in the recruitment, but also in the actual making of circus with those diverse bodies?
I think one thing is to make sure that your room, your rehearsal space in your room, and the people that are running that space are understand how to make that room accessible, and I mean safe and accessible to everybody. So actually the work, understand how to work with people in the best way possible to make that work. So I think that isn't always the case. I think it's about having those artists that are, I think it will need some key artists, and there are have been some fantastic disabled artists working in commercial circus who are going to change people's minds about what should be on stage, because sometimes people need to see that before taking a risk themselves. If you're the first person, it's often harder to go, okay, right, I'm going to do this. And sometimes it's about visibility. I think it's about visibility. I think, sometimes disabled people can be invisible on stage. I think it's about making sure the right, people are visible, and it's positive, and it's done in the right way. It's not done as a tokenistic way. It's done in a positive way. I think sometimes it could be tokenistic, but it shouldn't be the case. It should be done because they deserve to be in the same space as everybody else, and they're as good. And that's for me really, really important. I mean, I'm saying about commercial for me because I think public sector work, we often, as companies, are funded to make a particular type of work, whereas commercial is driven by other things, money, tickets, whatever. So I'm saying it's harder in commercial because you're having to persuade people to take those risks with you. That's why for me, like, once we can change that, then we're changing much more,
Yeah. And what that leads to is a stronger influence, arguably.
Yeah. And I think there is a different audience for commercial work. It's probably a bigger audience, wider audience. One of the reasons we do a lot of work outdoors is because it's a more democratic space. People aren't having to buy tickets, and there aren't barriers. Sometimes theatres can be a barrier to people going into a show. Outdoor work, people can come across it in lots of different ways. You reach a larger group of different types of people. So I think, that's why we've focused a lot on doing outdoor work.
It's a great point. It's also interconnected and cyclical, and it's all the pieces have to work together to be able to really move the needle. Yeah, absolutely. We have come up toward the end of our hour together, and I want to be very mindful of your time and folks who've joined us as well. Anything, Billy, that you'd like to bring up that we haven't had a chance to talk about? Anything special that hasn't yet been addressed?
I mean, the only thing the only thing I say is that I don't feel like I should, I'm here as the expert in that way. I feel like we all know how to make this work. Everybody, it's really about finding those partners and those collaborators, and it's about everybody's passion to make different types of work. I've made that decision to make this type of work because it was sort of it was an artistic passion. I mean, we're all political in different ways, and I want to make social change, but actually purely I'm just a maker of circus. And actually I wanted to make circus exciting for me personally. It's got an ultra, selfish point of view. I wanted to make really different, when I've made an incredible bunch of people and a great bunch of collaborators. All I say is that really, I think it is something that we can all do. We've all got the skill set to do. Just need to find those brilliant artistic collaborators to make that type of work. So I'd also advise everybody to go out and do that. I mean, that was our motivation for making Extraordinary Bodies, really, putting, and trying to change that work that happens on stage.
Well, at the risk of sounding a little bit cliche, what you are doing is extraordinary. And I think this idea that, yes, it's going to take time, it's going to move slowly, those are all true points, but I love the fact that you're doing it. You and your team and your collaborators and your co-directors, you're doing it. And I think this is really the key, is to, yes, we can talk about it. Yes, we can try to dive into some of the areas that are harder to figure out and harder to flesh out. But at the end of the day, you're making work with Extraordinary Bodies, Circus for Everybody. And I find that incredibly commendable.
I'd also like to say that I am really open to having other conversations if people want to get in touch, or I don't know how that works with Pro, but I'm very happy to have further conversations and be open to other ideas, and because I think that's how it changes, is just making new connections, and I'm really happy to offer advice or support or whatever people need.
That's very generous. Thank you. And we can certainly facilitate that. So for folks who are with us or someone listening a little bit later, apart from the links and the obvious access through the interwebs to get to Billy Alwen, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at Circus Talk, and we'll help connect the dots as well. Thank you, Billy. We're going to wrap it there.
Thank you for everybody.
And yeah, I will just like to finish with a quick note for all folks listening in wherever you are. Some of you know this already. We've been promoting it. Some of you, this might be the first time you're hearing this news. This, in fact, is going to be our last Pro Talk for this year, because Circus Talk is in a period of transition. And in fact, we've joined forces with Theater Art Life. And so this is an entertainment media site that together is going to become a new entity called StageLink. So we're very excited about this and the future iteration of both these digital platforms coming together. Particular focus on making it easier for audiences to access detailed information about performances and performers and creators and all the people that make this industry tick. There's also going to be something that you're very familiar with. It's going to resemble a lot the Circus Talk Pro experience. So we're talking enhanced visibility and networking opportunities, things just like this, and career support tools, all under the banner of StageLink. So knowing that we are taking a pause on this modality of Pro Talk, we would like to invite you, in anticipation of our summertime launch, to reach out. And if you have anything that you'd like to share about what you'd like to see in future versions of Pro Talks or variations on the theme, conversations just like this one with Billy Alwen, please don't be shy. info@circustalk.com. You're very welcome to reach out and share your 2 cents or your 5 cents, however many cents you want to share. Bring it. We want to hear from you. This is really going to help the next iteration, as I mentioned, StageLink. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Thanks again, Billy. Really a pleasure. I look forward to continuing our conversations. I know that we have a couple of things that are going to hopefully move forward. And thanks to all of you guys for being a part of this. There's a bunch of links in the chat for all the things I just spoke to if you want to have a look there. And don't forget, we have put in the links as well to Cirque, Bijou, and Extraordinary Bodies.